to actually come in. Good morning, folks. You're live for the IWFM Midlands Region Building Safety Continued. So today we're going to be talking through the Building Safety Bill and the Fire Safety Act, but we're going to allow a few minutes just for everybody to come online and make sure that everybody's there and present. And if I can invite you to use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen to have a think about any questions that you want to ask. You don't need to wait until later in the webinar to put those on there, and we'll give a few minutes for everybody to come in. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers today, and that's our panelist Sophie Hooper, who's our head of policy. Morning, Sophie.
Good morning, all.
Sophie is like our secret weapon in the institutes, who's constantly beavering away in the background, lobbying government, working with various different working groups and parties. So if you've not met Sophie before, here is our lovely lady behind all the knowledge, who's championing the course. And we'd also like to welcome you to Martin Ryan, who's the consultant for fire and facilities management for MGR Consultants, and he's one of our members of our life safety working groups. So myself, I'm Nicola Lathbury. I'm the managing director of Hexagon FM. We're a recruitment specialist for the FM sector, and I'm also your chair for IWFM Midlands and the IWFM group. So thank you for joining us today. So if you can have the next slide, please. So today we're going to be discussing the fire safety changes on the horizon, and that's around the Building Safety Bill and the Fire Safety Act. And this came about following the previous webinar that we hosted as IWFM Midlands around building safety management. So we had lots of questions that came up throughout the Q&A section in the end about fire safety. It's something that people feel a little bit vulnerable about. Sorry, folks, I'll put my teeth back in there, that they feel vulnerable about. And also, actually, in the shadow of Grenfell, it's something that people realise how seriously things need to be taken. So the good thing is that actually taking part in this webinar help you have things that can take information to the board. The guys are going to shed a lot of light on this for you. So if we can kick off with the first slide, and I'm going to hand you over to the lovely Sophie Hooper, who's going to talk to you about policy and what's been going on in government.
Thank you, Nikki. I'll just do a brief introduction about both bills and how, well, one bill, one act, and how they kind of relate to each other. And then Martin will be talking to the Fire Safety Act and the changes that will follow on that, and the Fire Safety Order. Now, past Grenfell, there were a lot of, post-Grenfell, there were a lot of questions really how the fire safety regime was functioning in the UK. And there were lots of questions around competence, etc. What are the standards of fire risk assessments? The two pieces of legislation belong to two different departments, actually. It's the Home Office that is responsible for the Fire Safety Order and the Fire Safety Act, and the Building Safety Bill belongs to the Ministry of Housing, Local Authority, which then has, of course, changed its name to the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. The way that this whole regime is being approached is very interlinked. And what we will have already seen is that the Fire Safety Act that Martin will be talking to was already actually passed last year and has royal assent. But many of the changes in the regulatory reform order will actually be changed once the Building Safety Bill will be going through Parliament and will be implemented. And the Building Safety Bill was finally tabled in Parliament in July last year, and it's very much anticipated that it will be receiving its royal assent in July. And that's quite important because the considerations are that secondary legislation is needed following from the Act, and then it will be implementing the new duties, etc., kind of between 6 and 18 months after the bill has received its royal assent. And some of the duties are already listed there. Now, 29th of March is mentioned there as well. Yesterday, the bill went through the report stage in the Lords, and there were some very interesting discussions there that we will discuss a little bit later. But that's kind of a little bit of an introduction of how the two different bills are kind of moving alongside in parallel trajectories, but they very much depend on each other for all the changes to come into effect. Martin, do you want to take the next slide?
Can do. Good. Sorry about that. Technical ability is not one of my strong points. Yeah, looking at how the scope expands from the Fire Safety Act into the current sort of FSO, the key elements are noted there on the slide, but it brings in external walls. Now, we'll discuss in a little while about the issues facing certainly fire risk assessors in terms of how they assess external wall issues and risk. And also flat front entrance doors come into scope in the new Fire Safety Act. And that presents all kinds of issues. It's something that needs to happen. I'm very much for that. However, as facilities managers and people who manage buildings and interactions between residents and everybody concerned, actually getting access to flat front doors could be a bigger problem than anything we face. And yet, probably the most important one for me is the flat entrance doors, because they're the key barrier between a possible fire within a flat and the common escape routes that would need to be used in that, in the event of that fire getting out of hand. The other elements listed on here are, with the external wall issues, we're looking at cladding, insulation fixings, windows, external doors and balconies. You would probably have all seen a few weeks ago in London the fire which sort of went from balcony to balcony due to the wooden structure on the balconies. I think it was Whitechapel. That indicates quite clearly how having timber balconies rather than concrete or metal can enhance the flow of fire. And it's not fantastic, but does that present a much bigger problem for us than the external walls that are possibly filled with, highly combustible materials? It's up for lots of debate, but actually trying to assess that and put a risk to that within the FSA is actually being brought into the scope of fire risk assessors. Now, I've been a fire risk assessor for a number of years, and to correctly apportion a set of risk to an external wall system takes much more than standing outside of a building and just looking up. So there are lots of other issues with that as well, regarding lack of insurance from the wider insurance companies and things. Can we go to the next slide, Lauren, please? Hello. Thank you. I think we've skipped one. That's the one. Thank you. Looking at the FSA power to change what buildings the FSO applies to in the future. Now, most commercial buildings come under the scope of the FSO currently. However, the FSA looks at mainly high-rise residential buildings and higher risk buildings such as schools and hospitals. So do we do we envisage the FSA powers being extended? I think so, definitely. We should really be looking at putting in process to manage buildings that are not likely to currently come under the scope when the FSA comes into force, and to sort of try and make changes in those buildings and get management processes in place ready for this to happen, because I think it's only a matter of time, whether it's a year, 2 years, 5 years down the line, we really couldn't say, but I think it will happen. I think it needs to happen. So I do think that there's a real element there of, I suppose you could call it getting ahead of the curve. But if we can look at the buildings we've already got, as well as the ones coming into scope, I think it's really important to do that. As it says at the bottom there, secondary legislation will amend the fire safety order relating to the phase 1 Grenfell recommendations and bring the FSA into power above the FSO. Again, next slide, please, Lauren. So, as the slide says, quick recap as to responsible person duties. This should be quite clear. However, in my experience of dealing with my clients, nobody really understands clearly who a responsible person is and what their duties are. So I'm not going to read the slide verbatim, but basically the responsible person is responsible for everybody and everything that happens within that building. Now, that's all relevant persons, so it's not just people who work or live in the building, it's people that could be in the building legally. It could be contractors, firefighters, other emergency workers, people walking past the building. With the high-rise buildings, if a building does go on fire, the possibilities of people being injured around its perimeter. So there's quite a big scope for the responsible person. And the idea originally of the process behind the Grenfell inquiry and Dame Hackett's recommendations were that we put in additional layers of competency and checks to ensure that these duties were carried out at a much more ground level. Hence the reason for the building safety manager appointment. I'm going to let Sophie pick up on that a bit more later. But realistically, the responsible person should have always appointed competent persons to assist them. Generally, does that happen? Not in my experience. You may find that, for instance, if you've got a local authority that runs a school, they're a responsible person. The head teacher of that school would be deemed as the person under Article 18 to assist the responsible person, being the local authority, in undertaking the preventative and protective measures. Do most school heads have a clue about fire safety? I would probably argue that most don't. And that's where the problems arrive. Now we look at the proposals of of all of the legislation and the feeding to this inquiry. Were all based around the appointment of an appropriate person, and also a building safety manager whose duty would be to make sure that the buildings were safe and that everything was in place. And again, who's to say that a responsible person is competent? We currently have no real measures. There are duties under the order, that, as it says on the right hand side, but that doesn't necessarily mean that responsible people are properly competent in discharging their duties. Can we have the next slide, please, Lauren? Again, these are the fire safety consultation government responses. Again, I'm not going to read these verbatim because it's all there quite clearly to see, but it all hinges around making sure that we have much more recorded provision in place, that we've got duty holders, we've got sharing of information. I did a piece for a number of years in student accommodation, and as part of the duties of the RP going outwards, when you changed managing agents, they should deliver you all the fire safety information for the building. In, I don't know, maybe 20, 25 building handovers, I was never given any fire safety information at all for any of those buildings. So we were looking for, as part of the life safety working group, much more power to make sure that these kind of things happen. And if they don't, a route to make sure that it does happen, and that we can be, people can be held responsible for not making it happen. I think one of the most important ones on there is the premises information boxes, PIBs. Now, it's saying there that they'll be required in all new blocks of flats with stories above 11 meters in height. I would probably say they're needed in all buildings where it's likely that you have people who can't self-isolate. Can't self-isolate. That's the good old COVID thing, isn't it? Can't self-evacuate. And that information needs to be readily available in those boxes for the firefighters that turn up to site. Doesn't need to be elaborate. All it needs to be is flat numbers and, what the issues are. And there's also a real set of key guidance that needs to go into those boxes, so we do keep it minimal. I know we've discussed within the group about whose duty it is to keep those documents up to date and relevant. It's been argued that it should be the manager of the building or the responsible person. I do think that residents of those buildings need to have a lot more input on that, because it's their information, it's their issues, that if there's any change in anybody's circumstances, that needs to be reported to the building owners, and it should be their duty to keep the documents updated. So can we have the next slide, please, Lauren? Just bear with me one sec, excuse me. We know that there's much more work required in the following areas listed on here. There's been a big debate this week that I'll let Sophie pick up with you in a while around fees and charges and the requirements for building safety managers and whether they should be paid for and who should pay for them. False fire alarms, an ongoing issue that we most of us that run buildings are sort of presented with a lot of the time. I think the provision of information to residents, again, is that resident engagement piece that was due to fall under the building safety manager's remit, that if we remove that element, who does that come down to? And the likelihood is that it'll come down to whoever the FM is in that particular building to carry out that resident engagement and to, as it says there, some elements are already in the building safety bill relating to this. Consultation around access to sites, to flats, for examination of flat front doors during fire risk assessments, information from residents to keep them up to date about any fire safety changes or any general safety changes within the building. This will all fall, in my opinion, on the facilities manager, whoever's responsible for that site. It says there about the policy approach to PIBs in existing buildings and to define what should be stored in them. I think it's very simple, really. As little as possible, concise, absolutely clear information for any firefighters that turn up and need to understand what hazards they're facing in the building, really. And those hazards can mean having to evacuate people who can't self-evacuate should the need arise, and for the fire authorities to have a clear understanding of who and where and what issues there are. PEEPs, I wrote an article on PEEPs. It was a challenge to the revised version of PAS 79, which is a document we use for fire risk assessment, and it was a challenge from one of the families in the Grenfell Tower fire, that they believe that a PEEP should be, again, the responsibility of the building managers, owners. And I strongly disagree with that, along with Colin Todd, who had a key hand in reevaluating the past 79 document. I strongly believe that any PEEPs information has to be a collaboration with the residents, with the residents' family, and to make sure that anything like that is clearly up to date. I think there should also be an element of, you know, do we look at whether we need to relocate people if they can't? You know, would we really want our parents on the 20th floor of a high-rise residential building with a single stair? Not me personally. So there's an element to you know, personal responsibility with this as well, and not just a responsibility of the landlord or the building owner to make those decisions for people. Can we have the next slide, please, Lauren? I don't know whether any of you guys have actually downloaded and read the past 9980 document that was recently published. I don't know whether it's just sad individuals like me that read these kind of things, but again, I think there's one passage. There's one passage in this document that really sheds light onto it, and I will read this one verbatim. It's on page 11, and the element they're talking about is fire risk assessment to the external wall system. So I'll read the paragraph because it explains itself. So it says, equally, it is not implied that an FRA-EW will be required for all high-rise or low-rise blocks of flats. In many cases, it will be manifestly obvious to a competent fire risk assessor that the risk to life from fire spread over external walls is not such as to warrant an FRA-EW by a specialist. In these cases, the fire risk assessor will normally address compliance of external wall construction with the fire safety order as part of the FRA. Well, two intrinsic issues there. One, as a fire risk assessor, you're not necessarily going to be technically competent to decide whether cladding on a building is safe or not safe and does need additional inspection by a specialist organisation like it implies there. And the secondary thing is around insurance and the availability of insurance, which for anybody in my profession now in the fire safety world will understand just how difficult and pretty much impossible it is to get any kind of insurance for us to comment on external wall systems. So I just think that while the pass overall is pretty good, that one paragraph speaks volumes to me that we're still nowhere near fully understanding the implications of asking fire risk assessors to evaluate external wall systems. I just think that that's one of the biggest issues moving forward with the new building safety bill and the new FSA that pulls these areas into scope. And you will have a big hole in any fire risk assessment, because fire risk assessors generally at the moment just cannot get insurance to comment on these kind of things. And at that point, I will hand back to Sophie, who's going to pick the next section.
That's me. Thank you very much. Can I please have the next slide? And I think some of these areas have been discussed by Martin already, that there were a whole bunch of recommendations from the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 1 report that are going to be taken forward. And they will be taken forward mostly by secondary legislation that is still due to be put forward. And will, of course, as part of the Life Safety Working Group, part of the work that we're doing is kind of monitoring that environment and seeing what comes up so we can share it with our members. The whole thing around firefighting facilities and monthly testing, not just of lifts, but also of fire doors, is going to be quite important. So fire doors will need to be checked not less than 3 monthly. But there are other things that should already be in place including things like clearly marked floor levels or flat signs. A big area that still needs to be addressed are the premises information boxes, and I already picked up a question on that. What precisely will need to be contained in them, and where they need to be placed, etc. All of that will still be decided and will be put forward via secondary legislation, what should be contained in them. But what they are considering is that the paper and electronic plans of the building should be in there, and evacuation plans. And there will be other things that will need to be included in that. But as Martin already said, you know, that is information that is going to be really important for firefighters. So it needs to be clear and it needs to be pertinent. Can we please have the next slide, Lauren? The building safety bill, then, that is what I've been working on for the last 5 years since its conception within the Dame Judith Hackett report. Her report there says she did an independent review of the building regulations and fire safety. And she was pretty brutal in her assessment about the state of the built environment sector. But what our members of the life safety group at the time also acknowledged was that she was pretty honest and clear in her assessment. And moving forward for the recommendations, the key areas that she thought needed to be tackled was that clear model of risk ownership, defined roles. And that's something that Martin also talked about for the fire safety order, and the clarity around who is responsible for the, well, who's the responsible person? Big question. What she also thought was that there needed to be simpler and effective outcomes-based regulatory framework. The framework itself needed to be clear, rather than this warren of different pieces of legislation. Whether we'll get there remains to be seen. Now, a really important element that she indicated was that buildings needed to be seen as a systems approach. So rather than a siloed approach where different elements would be tackled by different parts of organizations, she really thought it important that buildings were approached as a whole life ecosystem. One of the key areas that we always advocated needed greater improvement, because it's what we base our decisions on, was the provision of information. And that's what the next two bullets really are about. It's about having that whole risk-based approach to regulatory oversight, but based on that documentation and accurate information. And that's why it's important that there is also that transparency of information, and that you can follow it throughout the life cycle of a building. And of course, one element that was really important, if not one of the most important elements, was about making sure that we empower residents and give residents a stronger voice, so that they are involved actively also with maintaining safety in buildings. And a last bit, which has been pretty pivotal to the work that we've been doing, was the whole competence piece, because you need culture change, and culture change is ultimately embedded within people that know what is the right thing to do based on the skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviors that they demonstrate. And so what she outlined was a very huge ecosystem that would touch on all the different professions that were linked into supporting the safety of a building throughout its life cycle. And so accountability, information and documentation, residency engagement, and competence were really quite key for her. And as the building safety bill is going through the Parliament, we can see that some bits are being met, some not so. May I please have the next slide, Lauren? So I think it's important to talk through a few of the key concepts of the building safety bill in the occupation phase, because the building safety bill covers design and construction, and then of course lastly the third phase, the occupation phase. And it's important, of course, to understand what is the scope, to what buildings will this bill apply. And you can see there that obviously it's buildings that are 18 meters in height and 7 stories. Originally it was 6, and there need to be at least 2 residential units. Now, interestingly, hospitals are included for the design and construction phase, but they fall outside the scope of the occupation phase, for example. And what exactly is the building safety bill covering? Well, it's covering building safety risks that follow the spread of fire and structural failure. And the reason why it doesn't say fire is because in itself, effectively, it allows for a fire taking place within a person's residential unit. The problem is when it starts spreading. And so that's really the whole thing about compartmentation, etc. What the key risks are is that it's the spread of fire that they're now really focusing on. You see the accountable person there. Now, the duty holder in the occupation phase is the accountable person. They are the ones that are accountable. But that's slightly different from the design and construction phase, because actually the accountable person does not have a competence requirement, which is different from the duty holders in the design and occupation phase, where the competence requirement is coincides with the accountability requirement. So the accountable person does not have to be competent to be the accountable person. And that is linked because there can't be any preconditions to actually owning something, because that is a right that people have to own something. Now, there's also what is new in the building safety bill is the concept of principal accountable person. And that was inserted because when the pre-legislative bill was published, when the draft bill was published, we raised a lot of issues around the fact that actually a building can have multiple accountable persons. So and that would then allow people to kind of shift responsibility and accountability to each other. So there needs to be clarity about this one accountable person or organization taking the lead on building safety. What doesn't mean that other accountable persons are don't have any duties. It just means that there is one person that takes the lead and coordinates a whole bunch of things. May I please have the next slide? And I think it would be very interesting to quickly cover what the duties of this principal accountable person actually are. And as you see, it's quite clear that in discussion in Parliament yesterday, the big red stripe means that the building safety manager, or the duty to appoint a building safety manager, the government's amendment, which was put forward last week, was discussed yesterday and seemed to have been accepted very much and very much welcomed by the Lords, who in report stage discussed the bill. And we'll no doubt touch upon some of that in the question session. But some of these various duties, the reason why they exist, registration and certificates, for example, is the registration requirement in itself really allows to meet for the identification of that principal accountable person. And that goes back to the concept that we discussed a few slides back from Dame Judith Hackett, where she was all about it needs to be clear who is accountable. So by building in a registration requirement, you need someone to step forward to identify themselves as they are going to be accountable and responsible for the building. And the duty to apply for a building assessment certificate, that then allows the regulator to check if the principal accountable person has done There are other duties, like they need to make a safety case report, they need to assess the building safety risks and then outline the different steps that they are taking to mitigate those risks before people can move in. They need to set up a mandatory occurrence reporting system. They need to have a copy of the resident engagement strategy before they move in. And they also need to have prescribed information about compliance to make sure that each of the different accountable persons, if there are multiple, that they comply with their duties, especially with regards to providing information to various people and organizations. So obviously the duties there relating to building safety risks, they are extremely key. So you've got the assessing and the managing of building safety risks, and how you then lock that into your evidence base, into your safety case and safety case report. And there are other duties relating to information and documents, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in some of the next slides. But the mandatory reporting requirement, that's basically a new requirement which basically says if this situation exists, you need to report this. If you don't report this, that's a dereliction of duty. But it also means that if you have reported it, then you can't be prosecuted afterwards for raising the attention of this important defect, for example. Laura, may I please have the next slide? Thank you very much. Now, this is a very busy slide, but please don't worry too much about that. It is to kind of illustrate in a visual manner what the duties are. So they are kind of at more operational level, some of the elements that would be expected that would be done. And that's credit to Mark Snellin, who drafted this, who I work together with in the Building Safety Alliance. So there is a group of organizations that have continued the work of Working Group 8, and Working Group 8 looked at what the competence for the building safety manager should be. And we kind of divvy up some of the work, and Mark is excellent at drafting these visual schemes who are very clear. Now, what this actually clarifies as well in a very visual way is the whole golden thread requirement, and that is a very important and quite big duty to document all those different things, including the safety management system, etc. It's not good enough to have a safety management system. You also need to document the arrangements that are in place. And actually what it illustrates there is that the one duty that falls away, the appointment of a building safety manager, I think no doubt there will be questions later about how significant that is for the regime overall. But I think what this clearly shows is that the duty around the documentation and the maintaining of information is very important, and that will require quite a bit of competence to understand all those different elements, including the assessment of building safety risk, managing building safety risks. Well, that's risk management for you, and a whole bunch of other things. So you need to set up a system and a safety management system, and then the safety case, and actually the resident engagement, including the strategy, but also a complaint system and providing information to residents, is very, very important. Can we please go to the next slide? And seeing how important that whole golden thread of prescribed information is, I thought it was worthwhile to go over some of these principles and concepts, because it really is quite important. Now, this golden thread of information is not just going to appear somewhere within the occupation phase. The whole idea is that it starts to be collected within the design phase, is built on in the construction phase, to then move to the occupation phase. And so at Gateway 3, before a new building is taken into ownership, then that information would be handed over to the occupation phase. So it's about strengthening the origin of information so it can then be maintained. Now that's pretty clear for new buildings, but for existing buildings, this will still need to be done. Now, the aim of the safety case regime is to ensure that accountable persons deliver a continuous preventative and proactive approach to management of building safety risks. And so really it's about accountable persons demonstrating that building safety risks are being managed proportionately for the buildings under their control. And there's really two important concepts. You've got the safety case, and as you can see, that's basically all the documented information that a building will have. And then you have, distinct from that, the safety case report, which will basically be a summary of that entire safety case. And it will be predominantly the risk assessment of building safety risks, and then the steps to prevent a major risk or the reducement of the severity of an incident. Now, that safety case report will be checked by the regulator. And for existing buildings, it's anticipated that once the bill has received its royal assent and once the duties come into place, that it will take them about 5 years to kind of review the existing buildings in scope and their safety case reports. So the safety case report is something that needs to be kept pretty live and up to date, because the principal accountable person needs to revise it every time there are new steps or a new assessment that has been made. And the principal accountable person also needs to inform the regulator that they've updated the safety case report. And then when the regulator decides that they want to review the safety case report, the principal accountable person needs to hand that over as soon as possible. And there are some wider duties relating to the maintaining of the full body of documented information, including that, well, you can see the different duties that relate to that. So the safety case itself is distinct from the safety case report. I've included a link to the HSE guidance a little bit later that has got more information about that, because these are pretty critical concepts about this. May I have the next slide, please? So the whole engagement with residents, everyone will get the slides. I'll let you read this by yourself, but obviously resident engagement is important. It's going to be one of the pillars that will help to realise building safety, because managing empty buildings is a lot easier than buildings that are in use. And there will be some expectations on the residents as well, which is why there are some residents' duties. Now, access for dwellings is something Martin touched upon as well, which is not necessarily become a lot more straightforward. Now, yesterday's discussion in the Lords made it out as if it was very easy to get access to dwellings, but the Building Safety Bill still has got a process in place that needs to be followed. So it's not as if the bill is just going to allow people to walk in, which wouldn't be right either. May I have the next slide, please? So when you get the slides, this is some of the guidance that the HSE has already issued, and they will be issuing more guidance over the coming months. We'll obviously seek to update people, and they will issue more guidance on things like safety management systems, gathering building safety information, identifying building safety risks, prevention and protective measures, and building safety, the safety case report. Next slide, please. Thank you. I think it's quite important to really very briefly touch on this, because We started off with Dame Judith Hackett, who had very much this idea that there would be a very clearly identifiable person who was responsible for the day-to-day management of a very specific building. And her idea was all about one person per building, and they would be very competent. But in the consequent policy renditions, i.e. in the consultation and the draft building safety bill, you could really see that the policy started to move away from that. Also because we were thinking, is this going to be feasible? And so the idea was already that a BSM would be responsible for more than one building. And then when we saw the building safety bill, there was a statutory requirement for the role, which in itself, the Life Safety Working Group and IWFM were pretty grateful for, because finally that role, that statutory role, sent a very clear signal about how important it was to have a clearly defined role within the occupation phase. And it gave us some certainty of how important it was to manage buildings. Now, in the safety bill, where we ended was statutory role, but no duties. So we had this role, but they didn't need to do anything. But actually the bill then said, oh, but the contract that the accountable person will have will determine what they need to do. And where we really were then was not so much a person, but the whole concept had moved from an individual person per building to already an organization with a nominated competent person for many buildings. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you needed to appoint someone new or that there was a new position there, but someone within the organization that was responsible and that was competent for the role to support the accountable person. Now, as we'll talk about later, that duty to appoint this role is gone. May I have the next slide, please? In the near future, the PAS, Publicly Available Specification 8673, will still be published, and that is a framework for anyone who will deliver on the accountable person duties, or anyone who will more likely support the accountable person with the delivery of their duties. And you can kind of see the areas. I think it's pretty clear. We've already talked about that. Building systems, understanding things like the legal and contractual environment, understanding risk management. How do you effectively deliver safety? How do you effectively communicate with residents? Monitoring and control of work, all that falls within the scope of what the PAS will do. And even though the duty to appoint a BSM will be gone, these are still the competences needed to deliver on the duties of the accountable person. And now, may I have the next slide, please? While the PAS was going to outline the competences, it wasn't necessarily going to provide all the different answers on what the role would actually be. Because the HSE guidance that was expected to come, and I appreciate this is a busy slide, it's more than anything, it's a bit of a pointer of that table at the top there with all the different colours around what are these people going to do, because the HSE guidance that is going to be published is very much going to be outcomes based. It's not necessarily going to give any information about what the role of the AP actually is going to be. So they were very reliant on us as a sector to talk about how we saw the role developing. And next slide, please, Lauren. We've got some different delivery models. And now some people might say, if there was a discussion yesterday in the Lords that got rid of the need for a BSM, why do you still put this slide on? Because actually, the AP duties still need to be delivered. So how are people now going to deliver that? And where is the competence going to come from? Because those different options will still exist. Option 1 and 2, probably private sector. they are going to appoint probably an external organization to deliver on some of these, or will they deliver people internally, appoint them to make sure that they take on some of this explicit duties, and they may be existing people. Option 3 was kind of foreseen for the social housing sector because they very much operate already as organizations and probably already have individuals internally that would lead on the duties. And then, of course, you've got the self-delivery of things. If there are any questions later about this, then people can always get in touch via policy@iwfm.org.uk. Right. May I have the last slide, please? And I think this effectively is taking us to the discussion, the Q&A session, Lauren, because yesterday's discussion within Parliament got rid of the need and the duty for the building safety manager, with the key question being who's now going to be competent to deliver on all these different duties. And I think the acknowledgement and key takeaway was that while the duty might have gone to, the realization is that people within organizations still need to deliver on it, and they still need the upskilling required against that PAS. There are still some outstanding questions from yesterday's debate, but we'll need to explore how some of this will settle once the debates have settled. And I'm afraid that was our whistle-stop tour on recent developments within that. Nikki, do you want to?
Thank you, Sophie. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Martin. Right, so we're going to, if you can have the next slide, please, Sophie. We're going to take some questions from the delegates. So thank you ever so much for getting involved, folks. So first question is from Mark Phillips. Please excuse me looking to the side. I've got two screens open with everything on here. Sorry, Mark Griffiths. How regulated will the competency of fire risk assessors be managed under the bill? In the past, there's been a lot of armchair experts undertaking this role.
I'm happy to take that. So there is a requirement within the building safety bill to make sure that there is a competent person. Now, it's probably expected to be delivered under secondary legislation, what that competence actually means. And I should probably let Martin speak because he's been on the working group that has been looking at that. It's not just the BSM working group that we've covered. There is a whole ecosystem of an industry competence committee that sits within the regulator that will deal with some of this. Martin, sorry.
No, that's fine. Yeah, we worked on a competency. I can't say it now, Nick. Competency process called Raising the Bar. Oh, probably about 18 months ago now, probably slightly longer. Discussing exactly this, and unfortunately, there still are quite a lot of armchair experts out there. I'm afraid the simple way to answer it will be forget how regulated it will be, and as any duty holder who needs to appoint a fire risk assessor or any fire safety professional, the best way to achieve that is to look at it from a third-party accreditation perspective. So whether that be with the IFE or FIA or IFSM, my business is accredited through the BAFE SP 205 scheme, which relates directly to fire risk assessments and the threat to life from fire. So that's the starting point. But what I would also say is ask for references, get a copy of a format of a risk assessment. We do all of that as a part of standard procedure when we speak to a new client. We also send out a scope of works that covers everything that we will do and won't do during the risk assessment process, and it also includes methodologies and the processes that we work to under the PAS 79 process. So my answer to that in a nutshell, Mark, is it will be regulated and there will be recommendations under the bill, but ultimately it's down to the duty holders choice of risk assessor, and making sure that they're competent in the first place. So third-party accreditation and past assessments and references, I think, is probably the best way to achieve that.
Brilliant, thank you guys. We've got a question here from Paul Thomas. Are we seeing the professionalism of facilities management finally? I hope so, from Sophie's perspective, because she's been working bloody hard on this.
Amen to that, Nicola. Yes. It is, of course, disappointing that that was dropped, basically on the basis of trying to avoid costs to leaseholders. Now, it's right to reduce costs to leaseholders, or at least make sure that any of the costs are very proportionate, but it doesn't take away that actually the competence requirements that will be laid into that PAS will absolutely be best practice for property management, and therefore hopefully that will genuinely filter through. And whether there's legislation on this and a regulatory requirement or not, this is stuff that should be done. And we're already seeing some across the industry taking the work that WG8 did and trying to drive that forward across the built environment. And the PAS work builds on that and will kind of cement that and will eventually become a British standard. So I absolutely think that this is now a time to build on that, because of course there are people that would achieve that already, people and organizations, but we need to make sure that it filters through across the sector.
Brilliant, thank you.
And I can add to that in that we get into buildings in all sectors, everything from local authority to private sectors, and certainly our experience is, and I know I'm biased because I'm a facilities manager by trade, but I've definitely seen an improvement in the quality over the last 10 or 12 years. And I think, yeah, we're at that point now where when I got into the industry, everybody was trying to strive for it. And I think we've actually made massive inroads in the last 10 or 12 years. I honestly do. So yes, I think we are seeing that professionalism come through now.
Brilliant. Thank you, folks. So I've got a question from Keith here. I'm trying to rattle through these questions as fast as I can, because I'm aware that people are usually allocated an hour to come on to here. From Keith West, do you think that the safety case report and its supporting safety case information will replace the need to undertake a fire risk assessment in a relevant building? No. That's a very definite
simple answer is no.
No, if anything, it's going to be more important to undertake that fire risk assessment to the right standards as well, because the regulator will review it as part of the safety case report.
Brilliant. Okay, nice and clear then. So question from Kevin, PIBs, is there a proposed template or is this for FMs to define? And if there isn't, is this something that we could potentially put together as best practice on the life safety working group? Sorry, I've just given you another job there if there isn't one.
No, that's okay. I think we already noted it down. What we will be seeking to do is engage with the Home Office when they are looking at the templates on this to make sure that they are appropriate. I would expect that they are still going to consult on that, but I think it's going to be dealt with under approved document B or the FSO under regulations. So that's about what needs to be contained within that. So it doesn't exist yet as such, as far as I'm aware, but it will come. And then we would hope to feed into that to make sure it's appropriate.
Brilliant. Okay.
I've already got a template that I made a few years back when I was looking after some high-rise residentials for a local authority and also care homes, nursing homes, that kind of stuff. So I have got a template and I'm happy to share it. It's not official and it's not, it's my opinion of what should be in there as a minimum. And the key element is what is in there should be A, as clear and concise as possible, and B, as up to date as possible. They're the two biggest considerations.
Excellent. And how can people access a copy of that, Martin? Sophie, is that something that we can get out to people with a link or something?
Anybody
could.
If anybody can drop me a line. Nikki, if you let everybody know my email address, I'm quite happy to send it out to anybody if they want one.
I'm also happy to take these because the policy at IWFM.org UK might be slightly easier to remember.
Yeah,
excellent. Or if you've missed any of those, you can find me on LinkedIn and I get that directed through. And likewise, if there's more questions that people still want to ask, please jump onto LinkedIn with us. Let's get that conversation going in the community. You can put your questions on the comments. Sophie and Ryan will still be happy to ask. So can I squeeze one last question in with that?
Sure.
Is there a definition of hospital, and is it limited to healthcare setting with overnight accommodation, or could it include a healthcare setting without overnight accommodation, such as outpatient only hospitals and health centres?
Now, unless Martin says he knows the answer, I know it's in draft regulations where it's clear how hospitals is defined, but I need to pick it up and forward it. So I'd encourage Matt also to follow up with me afterwards, because it is in draft regulations on the gov.uk website. I know exactly where it is. I just don't know the information off by heart.
Perfect.
The key element is at the moment, all healthcare settings are covered by HTM 0502, which is a separate piece of fire safety legislation that sort of pulls in information from lots of different sources, has very clear guidance, for instance, on atrium within hospitals. But no, all healthcare settings all come under that HTM 0502 setting, but obviously there are different levels of risk when we look at overnight stays as opposed to just inpatient, outpatient process.
Excellent, brilliant. One final question. Is there a timescale for these requirements to be brought in place for commercial premises?
Well, it depends on the requirements. Some of them will be already, there are some requirements that are already in place, and they are listed on one of the slides, and that is things like floor signage, floor markers via approved document B. But most of what we've talked about today will be implemented by the Building Safety Bill, and that's expected to be Royal Assent plus 12 months.
Brilliant. Okay. Lauren, can I take the next slide then, please? So thanks ever so much for your questions, folks, and for getting involved with the discussion. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you found everything really useful today. So a quick takeaway from the discussions from myself around the people. Have you got the right people and the right structure in place ready for your delivery? Now might be a time to have a look and review that and engage with either specialist contractors or look at your recruitment to get the right people in with the right skill sets or the training. Your building around the buildings, is your building in scope for the new regime? Review the safety and remediate that where necessary. And your information and systems, are your systems all able to service the changes and the improvements that are coming? Now is a great time to actually review that. So I invite you to check back on the IWFM website for further information. We are looking for contributors to the Life Safety Working Group. If you are specialists in this area or this is your area of expertise, please do get in touch. The Institute can only do everything that it can do with their army of volunteers there. If I can have the next slide, please. So today's CPD number for you is 280-5595. That's 280-5595 for your CPD. Thank you so much for everybody that's taken part in this. Thank you for our speakers and all the hard work that you do in the background. And a massive thank you to the people on the Life Safety Working Group. Really, really appreciate that. Can I have the next slide, please? And just to quickly inform you, our tickets are on sale for Agents of Change, which is the IWFM conference that's going to be held on the 8th of June in Euston. If you're sick of being stuck behind the Zoom screen, please get yourselves out there, see some of our experts in action. We've got some super speakers that are available. Have a look on the IWFM website for that. And then finally, next slide, the entries are finishing. The deadline is the 1st of April, so you haven't got long left. If you are frantically putting your awards together, get that off. Make sure you get your tickets. If you've not attended before, it's an absolutely fantastic occasion to celebrate success within our sector. So that's all from me. Nikki Lathbury, thank you for allowing me to host and to bring this on behalf of IWFM Midlands Region. Massive thank you to our speakers today, Sophie and Martin. Big thank you for you and all our delegates for coming along, getting involved and putting your questions on. We really, really appreciate your participation. Thank you ever so much. I should go and get my polygraph in now, and thank you for joining us. You can catch us on LinkedIn to carry on the discussion. So we look forward to seeing you there. And any questions to policy@iwfm.org.uk. Take care. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.